Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The scent of freshly baked biscuits drifted across the village green, warm and buttery, mingling with the late summer air and the faint sweetness of cut grass. St. Mary Mead looked its most agreeable that afternoon, the sort of place where nothing more alarming than a burnt scone ever seemed likely to occur. Tables had been set beneath fluttering bunting, teacups clinked cheerfully, and polite laughter rose and fell like bird song. It was the annual charity tea, an event so familiar that many villagers attended without quite remembering when they had first begun doing so. Miss Marple sat slightly apart from the busiest table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes taking in everything while appearing to rest on nothing in particular. She had declined the offer to judge the biscuit competition, pleading age and poor digestion, though she accepted a small plate with one of each variety. It was always useful, she thought, to have a reason to linger and observe. At the center of attention stood the guest of honor, a visitor from outside the village whose presence had caused a ripple of interest long before the tea had begun. He moved easily among the tables, smiling in a practiced, reassuring way, accepting praise for his speech and polite inquiries about his health. To many he seemed an entirely benign figure, the sort who belonged naturally in well-kept drawing rooms and village fetes. Yet Miss Marple noted how his smile never quite reached his eyes, and how he glanced about him more often than necessary, as though measuring distances or counting exits. The biscuits themselves were much discussed. Some were crumbly and plain, others elaborately iced, all laid out with proud little handwritten cards naming their makers. There was good-natured rivalry, but also something sharper beneath it. Old grievances surfaced in gentle jokes, and compliments were sometimes edged with faint resentment. Miss Marple had seen it often enough. Small competitions had a way of loosening tongues and stirring old emotions. Tea was poured, plates were passed, and the guest of honor accepted a biscuit offered to him by a woman whose smile lingered just a moment too long. He thanked her, breaking off a piece and eating it with evident enjoyment. Miss Marple noticed how her hand trembled as she withdrew it, though whether from nerves or excitement was not immediately clear. Conversation swelled, then gradually shifted as a sudden silence spread from the center table outward. Someone laughed too loudly, then stopped. A teacup rattled against its saucer. The guest of honor had paused mid-sentence, one hand pressed lightly against his chest, his expression flickering from mild surprise to confusion. For a heartbeat, no one quite understood what they were seeing. He took another step, as if to steady himself, and then collapsed onto the grass. Chairs scraped back sharply. Someone cried out his name. Others stood frozen, unable to reconcile the cheerful scene moments before with the alarming sight now before them. The scent of biscuit seemed suddenly cloying, almost oppressive. Miss Marple rose at once, moving more quickly than many would have expected. She did not rush forward, but she did not hang back either. From where she stood, she could see the stricken man's face, already pale, his breathing shallow and uneven. Those nearest bent over him, speaking urgently, though their words blurred into frightened murmurs. A doctor was sent for, and someone ran toward the nearest telephone. The woman who had offered the biscuit stood rigid, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. Another villager began insisting it must be the heat, while a third whispered that he had looked unwell all afternoon. Explanations sprang up with astonishing speed, each more comforting than the last. Miss Marple watched, her gaze moving from face to face. She noted who spoke at once and who remained silent, who looked genuinely alarmed and who seemed almost expectant. Human reactions in moments of shock, she had learned, were rarely random. When the doctor arrived, there was little he could do. The guest of honor was pronounced dead with quiet finality, and the village fete dissolved into confusion and hushed disbelief. Teacups stood abandoned, biscuits uneaten. The bunting fluttered on, incongruously cheerful above the stunned gathering. As the body was respectfully covered and the crowd slowly dispersed, St. Mary Mead seemed to contract inward, its pleasant exterior cracking to reveal something darker beneath. Miss Marple, returning to her seat to collect her handbag, looked down at the plate of biscuits she had scarcely touched. One remained broken in half. Crumbs scattered lightly across the china. She studied it for a moment, then glanced toward the woman who had offered the fatal treat. The woman's face had gone grey, her eyes darting nervously as she answered questions. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, almost absent-minded, yet her thoughts were already arranging themselves with quiet precision. In villages like St. Mary Mead, she knew, death rarely arrived without an invitation, and it was seldom the guest anyone expected. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead was no longer scented with biscuits, but with speculation. News travelled faster than the milk cart, and by breakfast every household had its own version of events. Curtains twitched with renewed purpose, and voices dropped to murmurs whenever footsteps passed outside. The village, so orderly the day before, now throbbed with restless curiosity. The police arrived shortly after 9. Their presence lent a certain gravity that no amount of gossip could quite replace. Questions were asked carefully, notebooks opened, and the green was examined with methodical attention. Villagers hovered at a respectful distance, eager to be useful and even more eager to be heard. Each had something to contribute, a detail noticed, a suspicion formed, a theory ready to be shared. Miss Marple observed from her front window as neighbours gathered in small knots, exchanging information with the solemnity of diplomats. She noticed how stories subtly shifted depending on the teller, how certainty crept into voices that had been uncertain only hours earlier. It reminded her of the way rumours had spread during a long-ago church scandal, growing firmer and more dramatic with every repetition. When she ventured out later in the morning, basket on her arm, she found herself gently intercepted by acquaintances who wished to know what she thought. She smiled kindly and professed herself quite bewildered, suggesting that such matters were best left to the authorities. This appeared to satisfy most, though a few looked faintly disappointed. Miss Marple had learned long ago that people valued reassurance more than truth, at least at first. The woman who had offered the biscuit was the subject of particular attention. Some spoke of her kindness and her shock, others of her temper and old resentments. It emerged that she and the dead man had known one another years before, though the nature of that acquaintance was described in increasingly vague terms. Miss Marple listened without comment, noting how often sympathy and suspicion occupied the same breath. At the butcher's shop, 2 customers whispered that the death could not have been natural. At the post office, it was suggested that perhaps the biscuits themselves were to blame, though which biscuit and whose recipe became a matter of heated debate. Miss Marple bought her stamps and remarked mildly on how easily accidents could happen when people were distracted. The postmistress nodded vigorously, clearly relieved to embrace an explanation that required no malice. Yet malice lingered just beneath the surface. Miss Marple sensed it in the way conversations stopped abruptly when she approached, and in the tight smiles exchanged between certain villagers. She noticed, too, that one man who had been conspicuously attentive at the fete now avoided mention of the deceased altogether, changing the subject whenever his name arose. By afternoon the police had begun formal interviews. Doors closed, voices lowered, and the atmosphere grew heavier still. Miss Marple was called upon to recount what she had seen. She did so calmly, describing the moment of collapse, the expressions she had noticed, the general arrangement of the tables. She did not volunteer her thoughts, only her observations. The officer taking notes listened politely, though it was clear he expected little of consequence from her account. As she spoke, Miss Marple watched him closely. She had encountered his type before, competent, diligent, and inclined to favour the obvious. He asked about arguments, about raised voices, about anything dramatic. She answered truthfully that she had seen none of those things. Instead, she mentioned small matters, such as the tremor in the woman's hand, the way the deceased had glanced around before eating, the sudden silence that had preceded the collapse. The officer nodded, though his pen paused only briefly. When she was dismissed, Miss Marple returned home with a sense of quiet concern. The village's eagerness to settle upon a neat explanation troubled her. Death by biscuit was too absurd, too unsettling to be comfortably accepted. People preferred heat, heart, or fate, anything that did not implicate human intention. Later, she received an unexpected visitor. The woman who had offered the biscuit stood on her doorstep, eyes rimmed red, hands twisting together. She spoke in a rush, insisting on her innocence, pleading that Miss Marple must understand how dreadful it all was. Miss Marple ushered her inside, offered tea, and listened. As the woman spoke, fragments of truth slipped through the cracks of her distress. Old grievances surfaced, hinted at and then hastily denied. There had been words exchanged in the past, misunderstandings, injuries of pride. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, murmuring that such things were sadly common. She noticed, however, how carefully the woman avoided describing her last private conversation with the dead man. When the visitor left, somewhat calmer but still deeply shaken, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her armchair. She thought of the biscuit plate, of crumbs scattered where no one had bothered to clean them away. She thought of how easily kindness could be weaponized, and how often harm arrived wrapped in politeness. As evening fell, St. Mary Mead drew inward again. Lamps were lit, doors locked earlier than usual, and the village settled into an uneasy hush. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The pattern before her was simple, but she knew from experience that even the simplest designs could hide surprising complexity. Whatever the truth behind the silent death, she felt certain of one thing. It would not be found in grand gestures or obvious villains, but in the quiet corners of human behavior, where resentment fermented and patience wore thin. And those corners, Miss Marple knew, were places she understood very well. The third day after the fate dawned grey and close, the sort of weather that seemed to press thoughts inward and make even the most cheerful people irritable. St. Mary Mead responded accordingly. Doors opened cautiously, and errands were conducted with an air of purpose that barely disguised curiosity. Everyone wished to know what everyone else had said to the police, though few were willing to admit it. Miss Marple made her way to the village shop shortly before noon, choosing a time when she knew several regulars would be present. It was a small habit of hers, formed over years of quiet observation. People were far more revealing when they believed themselves to be among friends, rather than under scrutiny. She greeted the shopkeeper warmly, and took her time examining the shelves, listening more than she spoke. Two women near the counter were discussing the inquest in hushed tones. One insisted that the doctor had looked puzzled, which must mean poison. The other countered that such things were terribly unlikely in a village like theirs. Miss Marple glanced at them mildly and remarked that poison was not at all as uncommon as people liked to think, particularly when it could be administered so innocently. The woman stared at her for a moment, then laughed awkwardly and changed the subject. Outside, she encountered one of the men who had helped carry the body away from the green. He spoke with forced heartiness, remarking on the inconvenience of it all and how such unpleasantness could damage the village's reputation. Miss Marple sympathized, noting how difficult it was when outsiders brought trouble with them. At this, the man stiffened slightly, as though the remark had struck closer than intended, and he made an excuse to leave. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple considered the deceased more carefully. He had arrived in the village only weeks before the fate, yet his presence had stirred remarkable interest. Some had found him charming, others faintly unsettling. He had been generous with praise and attentive to local concerns, but Miss Marple recalled how selective his attentions had been. He sought out certain people repeatedly, engaging them in conversations that left them thoughtful, even troubled. That afternoon she received another visit, this time from a neighbor who prided herself on knowing everything that happened within 3 streets. She brought news of a quarrel overheard years ago, a financial disagreement that had never been resolved. Names were mentioned, motives suggested, and conclusions drawn with alarming confidence. Miss Marple listened politely, offering tea and gentle encouragement, but she did not share the woman's certainty. Old quarrels, she knew, were common currency in villages. Only some were worth killing for. When the neighbor left, Miss Marple reflected on the way memories sharpened after death. People recalled slights and disputes with new clarity, reshaping them into possible causes. Yet truly dangerous resentments often lay hidden beneath a surface of cordiality, masked by habit and politeness. Later that evening, she was summoned to answer further questions. The police officer appeared faintly weary, his earlier confidence tempered by a growing list of inconsistencies. He spoke of preliminary findings that suggested the death had not been natural. There were traces of something unusual, though nothing conclusive yet. He asked Miss Marple whether she recalled anyone behaving oddly near the biscuit table. Miss Marple considered her answer carefully. She spoke of small things again, the way one person lingered too long, another avoided the table entirely, a third watched the deceased with an expression that was not quite friendly. She emphasized how easily such details could be misinterpreted, yet how often they proved meaningful in retrospect. The officer listened more attentively this time, his pen moving faster. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly, troubled by a thought that had been forming since the day of the fete. The biscuit itself had been an inspired choice. No one questioned food offered in goodwill, especially in a setting dedicated to charity and community. Trust, she thought, was the most efficient disguise. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, replaying the scene in her mind, the tremor in the woman's hand, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the deceased's cautious glances. Each detail alone meant little. Together they suggested a pattern she had seen before, though she hesitated to name it even to herself. By morning, the village buzzed with fresh developments. Someone claimed to have seen the deceased arguing with another villager the evening before his death. Another insisted he had overheard a threat weeks earlier. Miss Marple heard these accounts with patient interest, separating embellishment from likelihood. She noticed two who remained silent as accusations flew, and who seemed almost relieved to see attention diverted elsewhere. She paid a visit to the church that afternoon, knowing that confessions often surfaced in sacred spaces, even when unintended. There she encountered a woman deep in prayer, her posture rigid, her lips moving soundlessly. When she noticed Miss Marple, she flushed and quickly composed herself, offering an explanation that was too rehearsed to be convincing. Miss Marple accepted it graciously, remarking on the comfort faith could bring in times of trouble. As she walked home, Miss Marple felt the investigation shifting, though the police had not yet realized it. The obvious explanations were fraying at the edges, and new possibilities were emerging, quieter but more dangerous. She knew better than to rush. People revealed the most when they believed the danger had passed. Back in her sitting room, she resumed her knitting, her thoughts moving steadily. The pattern was becoming clearer now, though several stitches were still missing. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was watching and waiting, hoping the village would settle for an easy answer. Miss Marple, needles clicking softly, had no intention of allowing that to happen. By the end of the week, the village had settled into a tense imitation of normal life. Shops opened and closed at their usual hours, tea was taken promptly at 4, and greetings were exchanged with practiced civility. Yet beneath these familiar rituals lay an undercurrent of suspicion that colored every interaction. People measured their words carefully now, weighing how they might be repeated once they left the room. Miss Marple sensed the police investigation was narrowing, though not necessarily in the right direction. The officer had begun calling on certain villagers more frequently than others, his visits increasingly focused on those whose past disagreements with the deceased were easiest to trace. Old letters were mentioned, a disputed sum of money hinted at, and an argument recalled with growing emphasis. It was all very neat, Miss Marple thought, and therefore unlikely to be the whole truth. She encountered one of the emerging suspects quite by chance outside the post office. The man appeared agitated, pacing a little before realizing she was there. He greeted her with exaggerated politeness, speaking at length about the inconvenience of police questions and the unfairness of being scrutinized for something that had happened years ago. Miss Marple listened attentively, her expression sympathetic. She remarked that it must be dreadful to feel misunderstood, especially when one prided oneself on respectability. The man agreed too quickly, and his relief at being believed was almost palpable. As he spoke, Miss Marple noticed how carefully he avoided mentioning the biscuit table, focusing instead on his whereabouts earlier in the day. It struck her as curious. People innocent of one thing often tried hardest to prove their innocence of another. She said nothing, merely wishing him a good day, before continuing on her way. That afternoon brought a development the village received with mixed feelings. The doctor's findings suggested that something had indeed been added to the biscuit, something subtle enough to escape immediate notice but lethal in its effect. The news spread with alarming speed. Those who had dismissed the idea of murder now spoke of nothing else. Fear sharpened curiosity, and curiosity fed speculation. Miss Marple was visited again by the woman who had offered the biscuit. This time she appeared calmer, though a brittle edge remained beneath her composure. She spoke of how unfair it was that everyone seemed to look at her now, how kindness had become grounds for suspicion. Miss Marple agreed gently, remarking that people often searched for guilt in the most visible places. She asked, almost idly, whether the woman baked often for others, or whether that day had been an exception. The question produced a moment's hesitation, quickly masked by a practiced smile. The woman replied that she baked frequently, always had, though Miss Marple recalled several occasions when she had declined such offerings. The discrepancy was small, easily explained away, yet it lodged itself firmly in Miss Marple's mind. As evening fell, the police officer stopped by unannounced. He seemed restless, frustrated by conflicting statements and the lack of a clear narrative. He spoke of one suspect in particular, describing how neatly the evidence appeared to align. Miss Marple listened, then remarked that human behavior rarely aligned so conveniently unless someone wished it to. The officer smiled thinly, uncertain whether she was teasing or serious. She spoke then of village habits, of how people presented one face to the world while concealing another beneath layers of politeness. She mentioned, without emphasis, how some individuals were remarkably adept at directing attention away from themselves by appearing helpful or distressed. The officer considered this, his expression thoughtful. He did not argue, but neither did he fully concede the point. That night Miss Marple reflected on how the village had already begun to rewrite the story. Certain names were repeated with increasing certainty, while others faded quietly from discussion. It was as though the community collectively desired a culprit, anyone who could absorb their unease and allow them to move on. The following morning she attended a small gathering where condolences were being expressed to a distant relative of the deceased. The atmosphere was subdued, almost reverent. Miss Marple noticed how one guest spoke warmly of the dead man's generosity, while another stiffened at the mention of his name. There were too many such reactions, too many emotional currents flowing beneath the surface calm. During the gathering, Miss Marple found herself seated beside a woman known for her composure and impeccable manners. They spoke of trivial things at first, the weather, the state of the garden, the inconvenience of disrupted routines. Then, quite suddenly, the woman remarked that it was fortunate the tragedy had occurred in public, where witnesses abounded. Accidents in private, she said, were far more troubling. Miss Marple agreed, adding that privacy allowed people to behave quite differently than they did before an audience. The woman's fingers tightened briefly around her teacup before she set it down with deliberate care. She laughed it off, but Miss Marple saw the flash of something like an alarm in her eyes. Walking home later, Miss Marple considered how often the most dangerous individuals were those who appeared least so. They understood the value of appearances, of being seen in the right places, performing the right gestures. The biscuit, she thought again, had been the perfect instrument. It invited trust, gratitude, and no suspicion at all. By the time she reached her gate, Miss Marple felt more certain than she had been yet, though certainty brought no satisfaction. Someone in St. Mary Mead had committed a terrible act, not in a moment of passion, but with careful deliberation. And now, as the village closed ranks around an easy suspect, that person was watching quietly, confident that the truth would remain hidden. Miss Marple unlocked her door and stepped inside, already resolved that it would not. The strain within St. Mary Mead became more pronounced as the days passed, like a fault line widening beneath carefully tended lawns and clipped hedges. People no longer pretended that life was returning to normal. Instead, they clung to routine as a shield. Greetings were shorter, smiles more deliberate, and every casual remark carried an unspoken calculation about who might be listening. Miss Marple noticed that invitations dwindled. Where once she might have been urged to stay for tea, she was now politely ushered out after brief exchanges. Privacy, she understood, had become a commodity. Everyone feared saying the wrong thing, yet everyone longed to unburden themselves. It was an uncomfortable balance, and one that made people careless in unexpected moments. The police presence increased. Uniforms were seen more frequently on the green, and the sound of a motor car stopping outside a cottage sent ripples of anxiety through nearby houses. One suspect, already favored by village gossip, was questioned repeatedly. His irritation grew with each visit, his patience fraying. Miss Marple observed him one afternoon arguing heatedly with an officer, protesting that he had already explained everything. The performance struck her as sincere, but sincerity and innocence were not always the same. That evening, Miss Marple received a note requesting her company for tea. The handwriting was precise, almost stiff, and the invitation carefully worded. She recognized the hand at once and accepted without hesitation. Such invitations, she knew, rarely came without purpose. The tea was served in an immaculate sitting room, every object arranged with deliberate care. Her hostess spoke warmly, if somewhat too insistently, about village unity and the importance of supporting one another in difficult times. She expressed outrage at the notion that someone from among them could commit such a crime. Miss Marple agreed mildly, remarking that people often surprised one another when under strain. As the conversation unfolded, Miss Marple allowed herself to drift, responding with gentle, non-committal phrases. She watched instead. She noticed how her hostess avoided any mention of the biscuit competition, redirecting the discussion whenever it threatened to return there. When Miss Marple casually asked whether she had baked anything for the fete, the woman replied at once that she had been far too busy, though Miss Marple distinctly recalled seeing her name among the entries. The contradiction was small, easily dismissed as forgetfulness, yet Miss Marple sensed its importance. Forgetfulness was often selective. She changed the subject at once, praising the tea and remarking on the comfort of familiar rituals. Her hostess visibly relaxed, mistaking discretion for ignorance. Later, walking home beneath a sky heavy with clouds, Miss Marple reflected on the patterns emerging around her. Several villagers had distanced themselves from the biscuit table entirely, while others spoke of it far too much. One person in particular seemed determined to establish an alibi that no one had questioned. Another appeared eager to encourage suspicion elsewhere, supplying the police with neatly packaged theories. The following day brought fresh tension. Word spread that the police were preparing to make an arrest. The village reacted with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Some welcomed the prospect of closure, while others feared the consequences of a mistake. Miss Marple felt a tightening in her chest. Arrests once made were difficult to undo, especially when they satisfied a collective desire for resolution. She paid a visit to the churchyard that afternoon, knowing it to be a place where emotions surfaced unguarded. There she encountered the woman who had offered the biscuit, standing alone by a yew tree. Her face was drawn, her composure frayed. She spoke bitterly of betrayal, of how easily kindness was repaid with suspicion. Miss Marple listened, murmuring agreement where appropriate. But she noticed how the woman's bitterness seemed directed not at the villagers, but at the deceased himself. A careless remark slipped out then, something about promises broken and expectations raised. It was quickly retracted, dismissed as grief-speaking, yet Miss Marple stored it away. People revealed the most when they believed themselves wrong. That night Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting forgotten in her lap. The threads of the case were beginning to converge, though the picture they formed was not yet complete. The motive, she felt certain, lay not in money or reputation alone, but in something more intimate. Hurt pride, long-nursed resentment, a sense of injustice that had festered quietly until opportunity presented itself. Opportunity had arrived in the form of a biscuit, offered with a smile in full view of the village. It was an act both bold and cunning, relying on the assumption that no one would look closely at what was meant to be shared. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the darkened street. Somewhere nearby someone was sleeping uneasily, fearing discovery. Somewhere else someone innocent feared being blamed. The difference between the two, Miss Marple knew, lay not in appearances but in patterns of behavior, in the small inconsistencies that betrayed deeper truths. By the time she returned to her chair, her resolve had hardened. The village might be ready to accept the first plausible explanation offered, but she was not. Too many details failed to align, too many silences spoke louder than words. If the police were preparing to act, then she would have to intervene soon, gently but firmly, before a convenient lie settled permanently into the village's memory. She picked up her knitting once more, her needles moving steadily. There was still time, she thought, but not very much. The morning the arrest was rumoured to be imminent, St. Mary Mead awoke to a brittle stillness. Even the birds seemed subdued, their calls shorter and more cautious, as though they sensed the village's unease. Curtains were drawn back early, and eyes lingered longer than usual on the street below. Everyone waited for something to happen, though no one wished to be the one it happened to. Miss Marple sensed the shift at once. There was a quality to the air she recognized well, the false calm that preceded a collective decision. She made herself a modest breakfast and ate it slowly, her thoughts ordered and deliberate. If the police acted now, they would do so on assumptions carefully nourished by fear and convenience. That, she knew, was how the wrong people so often paid for the sins of the right ones. She left her house mid-morning, choosing a route that took her past several cottages in quick succession. At one gate she paused to greet a woman who was trimming her roses with unnecessary vigor. The woman spoke sharply of justice and how such crimes must be punished without delay. Miss Marple agreed gently, remarking that haste sometimes obscured the truth rather than revealing it. The woman snorted, dismissing the idea, yet her hands trembled slightly as she resumed cutting. Further along, Miss Marple encountered the man most often whispered about as the likely culprit. He was pale and drawn, his movements stiff with exhaustion. When he saw her, he attempted a smile that faltered halfway. He spoke of sleepless nights and the strain of suspicion, insisting that the truth would come out if only people listened. Miss Marple listened attentively, offering sympathy, yet she noticed how his account had grown smoother with repetition, the rough edges worn away. By midday, the police officer called upon her again. This time his manner was markedly different. There was a hint of uncertainty beneath his professional courtesy. as though doubts had begun to trouble him despite his resolve. He spoke of pressure from outside the village, of expectations that the matter be concluded swiftly. Miss Marple nodded, commenting on how often conclusions arrive before understanding. She asked him, quite mildly, whether he had considered who benefited most from the current direction of the investigation. The question caught him off guard. He replied that justice benefited everyone. Miss Marple smiled and said that she meant socially, not morally. When blame settled conveniently, communities relaxed. When it lingered unresolved, they grew anxious. The officer frowned, thoughtful but unconvinced. After he left, Miss Marple felt certain that she must act soon. She spent the afternoon calling on several villagers under the guise of neighborly concern. In each home she listened more than she spoke, guiding conversations gently but deliberately. She asked about baking habits, about routines on the day of the fete, about long-standing relationships with the deceased. Answers varied, but patterns emerged. One woman spoke of how carefully the biscuit table had been supervised, how impossible it would have been for anyone to tamper with it unnoticed. Miss Marple agreed, then remarked that supervision often faltered during moments of emotional distraction. The woman flushed, recalling a heated exchange she had witnessed near the table shortly before the collapse. She had dismissed it at the time as trivial. Another villager mentioned, almost proudly, how they had tasted several biscuits but avoided one particular kind, finding it too rich. Miss Marple noted the detail with interest. People remembered what had pleased or displeased them, but rarely considered why. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned home, her mind busy but composed. She laid out her thoughts carefully, as if she were pieces of a puzzle. The motive was clearer now, rooted in betrayal rather than profit. The opportunity had been public, relying on trust and familiarity. And the behavior afterward, the selective memory, the eagerness to redirect suspicion, all pointed in a single uncomfortable direction. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching shadows lengthen across the street. A figure passed below, walking quickly, head bent, as though anxious to avoid notice. Miss Marple recognized the gait and felt a quiet confirmation settle within her. That night, sleep came fitfully. Miss Marple dreamed of village green she had known long ago, of fêtes and picnics marred by sudden tragedy. The faces changed, but the patterns remained the same. She woke before dawn with a sense of urgency that allowed no delay. By morning the village buzzed with restrained excitement. A police car stood discreetly near the green, its presence unmistakable. Whispers followed its arrival, swelling with speculation. Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a hat she knew lent her an air of harmless respectability. As she stepped outside, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. To intervene now would be to challenge not only the police, but the village's collective desire for closure. It would require tact, patience, and a willingness to be underestimated. Fortunately, those were tools she had long ago learned to wield. She set off toward the green, her pace unhurried, her expression mild. The final pieces were nearly in place. All that remained was to see whether the truth, once gently exposed, would be allowed to stand. By the time the second week after the death began, St. Mary Mead had lost its first raw shock and settled into something far more dangerous: certainty. Certainty about who must be responsible, certainty about motives neatly tied with bows, certainty that nothing else needs to be examined too closely. The village thrived on such conclusions. They were comforting, like a familiar armchair that hid its broken spring beneath the cushion. The police returned daily, though their visits grew shorter. Questions were repeated with a weariness that suggested answers were already known. Doors opened with polite smiles that barely concealed relief at being no longer of interest. Only one household seemed to draw the same attention every time, and the villagers watched with an air of grim satisfaction whenever the officers paused there. It was not that they wished misfortune on anyone, they would have said. It was simply that events made far more sense this way. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her habits unchanged. She walked at the same hour, attended the same tea, and listened. She listened to voices that dropped when she entered a room, and then resumed, slightly altered, as if a tune had shifted key. She noticed how often people repeated the same details, polishing them until they gleamed, while other details were allowed to fade entirely. Most telling of all was how certain names were now spoken with confidence instead of speculation. At the grocer's, 2 women discussed the matter while weighing out sugar. One insisted the killer must have panicked when things went wrong, while the other nodded vigorously, adding a detail she could not possibly have witnessed but felt must be true. Miss Marple paid for her purchase and remarked mildly that panic often produced very curious behavior. The women agreed at once, though neither could later recall exactly what she had meant. That afternoon, a small but noticeable disturbance rippled through the village. An object connected to the case, thought misplaced, had been found. Its discovery was met with murmurs of approval, as if it were the final piece of a puzzle already solved. The police received the news with evident relief. It was the sort of evidence that could be explained in a single sentence, easily understood and easily repeated. By evening, the story had travelled from doorstep to doorstep, growing firmer with each telling. Miss Marple heard the news last, from a visitor who seemed almost disappointed that she had not already known. She received it with interest, but without the satisfaction others displayed. Instead, she asked 1 or 2 small questions, the sort that sounded idle but were not. Her visitor answered readily, then paused, frowning, as though something had briefly unsettled her. She laughed it off a moment later and changed the subject. Later, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched in her lap. She was thinking of another village, long ago, where a similar certainty had settled like fog. In that case, too, an object had been discovered at just the right moment, pointing very neatly in one direction. It had seemed conclusive until someone noticed that it had been placed, not dropped, and that the person who found it had been the one least likely to look there by accident. It was never the object itself that mattered, she reflected, but the timing and the finder. The following day brought a sharper jolt. A private conversation, meant to remain private, escaped into the open through careless tongues. It concerned a disagreement between 2 villagers, one that predated the crime by many years and had been quietly smoothed over in public. Now it resurfaced with a new and sinister relevance. The story was incomplete, missing crucial context, but it did not matter. It provided motive, and motive was something everyone understood. The person at the center of this revived tale reacted in a way that drew immediate notice. Much, and too quickly. Miss Marple observed this from across a room, noting how the voice rose and fell, how the hands moved, how the eyes darted toward certain faces and avoided others entirely. It reminded her of a child once accused of stealing jam, who protested not only innocence but outrage that anyone could imagine such a thing. The child had, of course, taken the jam, but for a reason no one had thought to ask. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected caller. The visit was framed as neighborly concern, though anxiety lay close beneath the surface. The caller spoke at length, offering information freely, almost eagerly, about the crime, the suspects, and the dreadful strain of living under suspicion. Miss Marple murmured sympathy and asked nothing directly. Instead, she remarked on the difficulty of remembering small, ordinary actions during times of stress, how one might forget whether the kettle had been filled or the door locked. The effect was immediate, though subtle. The caller laughed, then hesitated, correcting herself in mid-sentence about a trivial detail she had mentioned moments earlier. It was nothing that could be challenged, nothing that would stand out to anyone else. Miss Marple nodded kindly, but in her mind the hesitation joined several others, forming a small but distinct pattern. When the caller finally left, relief was plain, as though some private test had been endured and survived. Miss Marple watched her go with a thoughtful expression. She did not believe the woman had come to reassure her, rather, she had come to reassure herself. The next morning brought news of a development serious enough to draw nearly the entire village into excited discussion. The police, it was said, were preparing to act. A formal charge seemed imminent. There was talk of statements, of timelines neatly aligned, of an end in sight. The village breathed easier, already imagining itself free of the discomfort of uncertainty. Miss Marple attended a small gathering that afternoon where the mood was almost celebratory. Cups were filled and refilled, and speculation gave way to confident assertion. Miss Marple listened, her smile gentle, her comments vague. When asked directly whether she agreed with the prevailing view, she tilted her head and said she had always found human nature remarkably consistent. People looked pleased, taking this as agreement. Only one person, seated a little apart, seemed ill at ease. This individual spoke little, watching others with an expression that flickered between triumph and apprehension. Miss Marple noticed how often their gaze drifted toward the door, as though expecting interruption. She also noticed something else, something very small, when the conversation turned to the discovered object and its importance. This person's fingers tightened around their cup, not in surprise, but in something closer to irritation. As the gathering broke up, Miss Marple remained behind for a moment, ostensibly to help with the cups. She remarked quietly on how fortunate it was that matters were nearly resolved, and how dreadful it would be if an innocent person suffered due to a clever deception. The words were mild, almost commonplace. The reaction, however, was not. For just a fraction of a second, a mask slipped. The irritation sharpened into something colder, more calculating, before being smoothed away. Apologies were made, laughter offered, and the moment passed. Miss Marple carried her cups to the sink with steady hands. In her mind, the pieces were no longer scattered. They had begun to align, not into the picture the village admired, but into another entirely, one that depended not on what people said, but on when they said it, and why. By the time Miss Marple reached the stage she privately thought of as her experiment, the village had grown restless with anticipation. Certainty, once comforting, had begun to itch. People wanted the matter finished, sealed away, so they might speak of it later with the pleasure of distance. The police presence, though steady, now felt intrusive rather than reassuring, and villagers had begun to measure their words again, wary of being remembered incorrectly. Miss Marple chose her moment carefully. She invited a small group to tea, selecting her guests not for their friendliness but for their usefulness. It was framed as nothing more than a quiet afternoon gathering, the sort she had hosted countless times before. The invitation itself caused no alarm, though one recipient hesitated before accepting, asking twice whether anyone else would be there. Miss Marple answered truthfully and detected relief mixed with something less pleasant. The sitting room filled slowly, the air thick with polite conversation and unspoken tension. Cups clinked, biscuits were offered and declined, and then accepted after all. Miss Marple took her usual place, listening more than she spoke, her eyes mild behind her spectacles. She began with harmless remarks about village life, the way routines altered under stress, how small misunderstandings could grow if left unattended. Heads nodded. Everyone agreed. Then, quite casually, she mentioned a detail from the day of the crime. It was not a dramatic detail, merely a small inconsistency in timing that she presented as her own confusion. She wondered aloud how one person could have been in two places so close together without seeming to hurry. Her tone was apologetic, as though she feared she had misremembered something trivial. The reaction was immediate but uneven. One guest laughed and waved the matter away, suggesting memory was unreliable at the best of times. Another frowned slightly, as if the thought had not occurred to them before. A third answered too quickly, supplying an explanation that was unnecessarily elaborate. Miss Marple thanked them all, appearing reassured, though she was not. She moved on, pouring more tea, letting the conversation drift back to safe territory. After several minutes she returned to the subject from a different angle. this time recalling a remark made by someone else entirely. She repeated it inaccurately, just enough to be wrong. The correction came at once, sharp and precise, from the same person who had offered the earlier explanation. The speed of it struck Miss Marple at once. People corrected errors when they mattered. She smiled and apologized again, remarking how admirable it was that some people remembered details so clearly under strain. There was a flicker of pride in response, followed by caution. Miss Marple filed it away with care. As the afternoon wore on, she introduced another small provocation. She spoke of the discovered object, wondering whether it might have been overlooked because people tended to see what they expected to see. She told a gentle story about a woman she had once known who hid something valuable in plain sight, knowing no one would think to look there. The guests listened, amused, though one shifted in their chair, gaze fixed on the teacup as though it might reveal something unwelcome. Miss Marple allowed a silence to form, long enough to grow uncomfortable. In that pause, she observed breathing patterns, the way hands moved, the subtle tightening around mouths. Silence, she knew, was often more revealing than questions. At last one guest spoke, dismissing the story as irrelevant, insisting the evidence was perfectly clear. The insistence was stronger than necessary, the voice pitched just a little too high. Miss Marple agreed readily, saying how grateful she was that clever people could see through such things so decisively. The compliment landed, but uneasily. When the gathering ended, most left with visible relief. One lingered, offering to help clear away. Miss Marple accepted with thanks. As they worked side by side, she spoke softly about how terrible it would be if someone had planned everything carefully, relying on the village's assumptions to carry them safely through. She wondered aloud how exhausting it must be to maintain such a performance day after day. The plate in her companion's hand rattled faintly against another before being steadied. There was a laugh, a denial, then a remark about nerves. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, saying nerves were understandable when one feared discovery, even unconsciously. The word hung in the air between them. A change came over the other's expression then, subtle but unmistakable. The friendliness thinned, replaced by calculation. For the first time, Miss Marple felt she was being truly observed in return, weighed and assessed. She met the gaze calmly, her face open, almost vacant. A moment later the mask returned, polite words were exchanged, and the helper departed, composure restored. Miss Marple remained alone, rinsing cups with deliberate care. She felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty that her path was correct. That evening, events took an unexpected turn. News arrived that another detail had surfaced, one that contradicted the tidy narrative the police had assembled. It was not enough to overturn their case, but enough to cause irritation. Miss Marple received the information with interest, noting how quickly it reached her, and who seemed most eager to discuss it. She went to bed early, her mind active despite her stillness. She reviewed every conversation, every pause, every eagerness to explain or dismiss. Patterns emerged not from what had happened on the day of the crime, but from what had happened since. Fear did not always reveal guilt, she knew, but the fear of being outwitted was something else entirely. The next morning, she encountered the same individual she had unsettled the day before. Their greeting was warm, almost effusive, and they spoke at length about how grateful they were that matters would soon be resolved. Miss Marple listened, noting how often reassurance was sought rather than offered. As they parted, Miss Marple made one final, seemingly innocent remark. She said how interesting it was that people often underestimated those who appeared harmless, forgetting that observation required no authority, only patience. The smile she received in return did not quite reach the eyes. Miss Marple watched the figure walk away, feeling certain now that her final test had succeeded. She had not accused, nor confronted, nor revealed anything of substance. She had merely allowed human nature to do what it always did under pressure, betray itself in small, unmistakable ways. By the following afternoon, the village had gathered in a state of uneasy curiosity. Word had spread that matters were at last to be clarified, though no one could say quite how or by whom. The police had arranged a modest meeting in the drawing-room where the key figures could be present, a sensible precaution, they said, to avoid further gossip. Miss Marple arrived quietly, taking a seat near the window, her hands folded loosely in her lap, as though she were there merely to listen. The atmosphere was strained from the outset. People avoided one another's eyes or else watched too closely, measuring every movement. The inspector spoke briefly, outlining what was believed to be the sequence of events, confident in the solidity of his conclusions. He named the accepted motive, the convenient opportunity, and the absence of any alternative explanation. Several villagers nodded, grateful to hear certainty spoken aloud. Miss Marple waited until he finished before clearing her throat gently. She apologized for interrupting, expressing her hope that she was not being tiresome. The inspector, indulgent, assured her she might speak. He had come to regard her as harmless, even helpful in her own quaint way. She began by agreeing with much of what had been said. Indeed, she remarked, the explanation was neat, almost comforting in its simplicity. She observed that people often preferred such answers because they allowed one to stop thinking further. A few smiles flickered, though some faces tightened. She then spoke of patterns, not physical ones, but human ones. She recalled similar situations she had witnessed in the village over the years, cases of small deceptions that grew larger because no one wished to appear rude by questioning them. She spoke mildly, almost rambling, telling a story about a woman who once pretended illness to avoid an unpleasant duty, only to find herself trapped by the sympathy she had encouraged. As she spoke, she allowed her gaze to wander, pausing briefly on each person present. When she reached one particular individual, she lingered just a moment longer, not staring, merely observing. That person shifted slightly but said nothing. Miss Marple returned to the matter of timing. She explained how everyone had accepted a certain sequence of movements without examining whether it matched what they knew of the people involved. Some were punctual to a fault, others habitually late. She wondered aloud why someone known for careful preparation would suddenly act in haste, while someone known for improvisation would behave with precision. The inspector frowned, beginning to sense the ground shifting beneath him. He asked politely where she was going with this. Miss Marple smiled apologetically and said she was nearly finished. She spoke next of emotion. Genuine shock, she explained, tended to make people inconsistent. They forgot things, contradicted themselves, and became oddly distracted. But those who anticipated shock often performed it too well. They remembered details with unnatural clarity, filled silences too quickly, and corrected others unnecessarily. There was a murmur in the room now. One person laughed nervously, remarking that everyone reacted differently under stress. Miss Marple agreed at once, saying that was precisely her point. She then mentioned the hidden clue, though she did not call it that. She described it as a small misunderstanding involving an object that had been assumed to belong where it was found. She explained how familiarity could be misleading, how people failed to question what seemed ordinary. She described, in careful detail, how the object must have been placed deliberately, at a moment when the household routines made such placement possible. The inspector interrupted her then, objecting that this was speculation. Miss Marple accepted the rebuke calmly, saying she was merely thinking aloud. She added, however, that speculation became certainty when paired with motive and opportunity that truly aligned. She turned then, very gently, to the person she had been watching all along. She addressed them kindly, almost affectionately, recalling how helpful they had been throughout the investigation. She thanked them for their clarity, their willingness to explain matters to others, and their admirable memory. She remarked how difficult it must be to maintain such composure while carrying a secret burden. The room fell utterly silent. The person addressed laughed, too loudly, insisting she was being ridiculous. Miss Marple nodded as though agreeing, but continued speaking. She explained how the real motive had nothing to do with what had been assumed. It lay buried in a much older resentment, one that had been carefully concealed beneath respectability and routine. She recounted the private confrontation she had engineered, the reactions she had observed, the corrections offered too swiftly, the irritation that slipped through the mask. She explained how the second revelation had been anticipated rather than feared, because it had already been accounted for in the plan. At last, she stated plainly, though without raising her voice, that the person before her had orchestrated everything, not in a moment of passion but with deliberate calm, trusting the village to see what it expected to see. The act itself had been simple. The deception afterward required far more effort. The inspector demanded evidence. Miss Marple replied that he would find it easily now that he knew where to look and why. She reminded him that guilt was often revealed not by what people did at the scene, but by how they behaved afterward, when they believed themselves safe. The accused stood very still, eyes darting around the room. For a moment it seemed they might deny everything again. Then something collapsed inward. The shoulders sagged, the carefully maintained expression faltered, and in that instant of defeat, the truth was visible to everyone. There was no dramatic confession, only a quiet acknowledgement, a weary admission that the plan had seemed perfect at the time. Miss Marple watched without satisfaction. She had seen it all before. As the inspector took control of the situation, Miss Marple remained seated, hands folded once more. The mystery was solved not by force or cleverness, but by patience and an understanding of the frailties that bound them all. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead settled into a quiet that was more deliberate than before, as though the village were consciously arranging itself back into order. Curtains were drawn and opened at familiar hours, kettles boiled on schedule, and conversations resumed their gentle rhythms. Yet something indefinable had shifted. People spoke more softly, listened more closely, and sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if remembering that not everything could be safely assumed. The house where the gathering had taken place was cleared and aired, the furniture restored to its proper places. Neighbors offered assistance with a careful politeness that avoided curiosity. The name of the person taken away was mentioned less and less, and when it was, voices dropped instinctively. Sympathy mingled with relief, though few cared to examine which feeling was stronger. Miss Marple returned to her usual routine with little outward sign of disturbance. Each morning she walked the familiar paths, exchanged pleasantries, and took note of the small changes that told her how the village was healing. She observed who lingered at garden gates longer than before, who avoided certain routes, and who seemed eager to fill silences with unnecessary chatter. Human nature, she reflected, always revealed itself most clearly after a crisis had passed. One afternoon she was joined for tea by a neighbor who confessed, in a hushed tone, that she could not stop thinking about how close they had all been to accepting the wrong conclusion. Miss Marple listened attentively, nodding. She remarked that people often preferred tidy explanations because they spared one the discomfort of doubt. It was not unkindness that led them astray, she said, but convenience. The neighbor asked whether Miss Marple had ever been afraid during the affair. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said that fear was a useful emotion when properly attended to. It sharpened the mind, she believed, provided one did not let it dictate action. What troubled her more was complacency, the belief that certain people were incapable of wrongdoing simply because they were familiar. Elsewhere in the village, practical matters were attended to. Official statements were made, paperwork completed, and the police departed with courteous efficiency. The inspector paid Miss Marple a final visit before leaving, thanking her with a mixture of respect and mild exasperation. He admitted, somewhat ruefully, that he had underestimated the importance of observing behavior rather than collecting facts alone. She accepted the compliment graciously, insisting that she had merely pointed out what was already there. As weeks passed, the story transformed in the telling. Details softened or sharpened according to the teller's preferences. Some emphasized the cleverness of the solution, others the tragedy of it. Miss Marple noticed how certain uncomfortable truths were gradually omitted, replaced by safer interpretations. She did not correct them. People, she knew, required their own versions in order to live peacefully with what had happened. One morning, while sorting her knitting, she paused over a small imperfection in the pattern. She undid several rows patiently, reflecting that mistakes, once discovered, must be addressed no matter how inconvenient. It was the same with people, she thought. Errors ignored did not disappear. They merely became more deeply embedded. A letter arrived from a distant relative of the accused, brief and restrained, expressing gratitude for the fairness with which matters had been handled. Miss Marple read it carefully and then placed it aside. Compassion, she believed, was essential, but it did not negate responsibility. Understanding why someone committed a terrible act did not absolve them of its consequences. The village children resumed their games, inventing stories that bore only a vague resemblance to recent events. Their laughter echoed down the lanes, a sound that reassured the adults more than any official reassurance could. Life, in its persistent way, insisted on continuing. On Sunday the church was fuller than usual. The sermon spoke of forgiveness and vigilance, of the dangers of pride and the necessity of humility. Miss Marple listened thoughtfully, aware of how closely such themes aligned with her own conclusions. Evil rarely announced itself dramatically, she knew. More often, it wore the mask of ordinariness and relied upon the reluctance of others to look too closely. Afterward, she lingered in the churchyard, exchanging a few words with acquaintances. Some thanked her openly, others with a look or a squeeze of the hand. She accepted all responses with equal calm, neither encouraging praise nor deflecting it too firmly. She had never sought recognition, only resolution. That evening, as the sun set over the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the light fade. She reflected on the affair with neither triumph nor regret. It had been an unfortunate necessity, nothing more. People were capable of great kindness, she knew, but also of great harm, often born from small, unchecked emotions. She picked up her knitting once more, the familiar motion steadying her thoughts. Somewhere in the village, doors were being locked, lamps extinguished, and families settling into sleep. St. Mary Mead, outwardly unchanged, carried its experience quietly within it, a reminder that even the most peaceful places required watchfulness. Miss Marple, content that her task was done, allowed herself a moment of rest. Tomorrow would bring its own small dramas, its own secrets, and its own opportunities for observation. Human nature, after all, never truly rested, and neither, in her own gentle way, did she,